Hi everybody, welcome to my channel. In this video, we are going to take a look into the case of Ruth Ellis. She is known to be the last woman executed in the UK, but after reading about her and how she got to this position of being executed, Ruth is a lot more than that. She's a perfect example of what is happening in the world still. Toxic and abusive relationships. On April 10th, 1955, Ruth shot and killed her cheating and abusive lover, and in her own words, she was guilty. So let's take a look at what happened and why was love so destructive to Ruth. But first, let's start from the beginning. So let's start with a little bit of background information which might help to shed some light to what happened and why. Ruth was born on October 9th, 1926 in Reprieve, North Wales. At age of 14, Ruth left school to work as a waitress, and then in 1941 her family moved to London. At the age of 17, Ruth met and got involved with a French-Canadian soldier. She became pregnant, and then she gave birth to a son. The man who was married returned to his family in Canada, and eventually he never contacted Ruth and their son again. To support herself and her young son, Ruth worked in factories and had clerical jobs, but they didn't pay much. She then started working as a nightclub hostess through nude modeling work, which paid her a lot more money. By early 1950s, Ruth was a full-service prostitute. She stopped working briefly but later returned to the same club. She then was offered and took the job of a manager at the Little Club in 1953. While working at the Court Club, Ruth met a man called George Johnson Ellis, and on November 8, 1950, they got married and moved to Southampton. And Ruth, who had been devastated when she and her son were abandoned by the French-Canadian soldier, the father of her son, early on showed patterns of someone who invested and couldn't stay away from toxic and abusive relationships with men. Ruth's husband George was a violent alcoholic wife beater. He was jealous and possessive. He started believing Ruth was having an affair, and the marriage deteriorated. She left several times and always returned, and this is her pattern of behavior. She leaves, but she always comes back and puts herself in a position of abuse. Ruth became pregnant and she gave birth to a daughter, but her husband refused to acknowledge the child. The couple separated and later on divorced. Ruth moved back to London and went back to sex work to make ends meet. Ruth and David met in 1953 and became friends. David was 25 years old, he was upper class, he worked occasionally. He spent most of his time racing motor cars and building cars. He was at the time engaged to another woman, and he also liked to drink a lot. Even though Ruth was aware David was engaged to another woman, this is how things unfolded. Ruth had a flat above the club she worked, and David moved in shortly after, even though he still had a fiancée. He lived there from Monday to Friday. The couple usually had arguments, mostly when David became drunk and insulted other members of the club Ruth worked. Even though Ruth wasn't in love with him, she kept the affair with David because he seemed concerned and devoted to her, and I call this controlling and possessive. In December 1953, Ruth became pregnant and David offered to marry her even though he was still engaged. But Ruth said it wasn't necessary because she wasn't in love with him. Then she decided to terminate the pregnancy. Well, they maintained their affair and she didn't take the affair serious because he was still engaged to another girl. Girl, what are you doing? You are in a pseudo relationship with a man who's engaged to another girl. Jump ship. Have some respect. So she wanted to break that relationship off, and to provoke David, she would tell him it was bad for business, her living with him, and he didn't like that. He didn't like to hear that. Then Ruth met a man called Desmond Cussen, and while David was away for 2 weeks, Ruth began an affair with Desmond. She thought it would end the relationship with David, but when he returned, she didn't tell him about the affair because he was getting jealous. After David returned, he told Ruth he had broken off the engagement and asked her to marry him. He then became very possessive and jealous. She didn't trust him because she knew he was seeing other women. He then became violent towards her on occasions because of jealousy. He would hit her with his fists. She started getting fed up with the situation and tried to end their relationship several times. In December 1954, she moved out of her flat and moved in with Desmond Cussen. But because David kept showing up at the club, she wasn't able to avoid him, so sometimes she would leave with him and spend the night at a hotel, because at this time she was in love with him. But they still would have fights in which he would hit her. But then he would send her flowers and apologize, and they would go back together. It's the typical toxic abusive relationship behavior where something bad was bound to happen sooner or later. As the time went by, Ruth started to become jealous and anxious. While they were living together, she noticed David was having an affair. She followed him and she confirmed that. She asked him to leave. They were finished and he left. But guess what happened next? She took him back. Girl, leave. Pay attention. How many red flags you need? Leave. Haven't you heard what Tina Turner said?
What's love got to do with it? What's love but a...
In March 1955, Ruth became pregnant. David was happy, then later he became violent. He punched her in the stomach and she miscarried a few days later. Ruth became ill after the miscarriage and was bedridden. David took care of her and then they planned to spend the Easter weekend together. However, on Good Friday, David left for a drink. He promised he would be back at 8 to take her out. Guess what happened? He didn't return, of course. And this is the point where she is completely out of herself. And remember, this is the girl who initially didn't care much about him. And then she makes a 180 and becomes possessive, jealous. She becomes furious at his hot and cold demeanor. She's exhausted of him cheating, of his drinking violent aggressions. So take a look at what happened next. Take a look at her behavior. Because he didn't return, she called his friend and asked him if David was there. The friend said no. She then started to suspect that the friend lied and she went there. And she found David's car at the house. She rang the bell. No one came. She telephoned the house, but someone hung up the phone. Oh my goodness, if someone hangs up on you, madness is about to happen. She became furious. This was escalating, can you imagine? She kept on calling and she heard a woman's giggle in the back. Imagine this. It's burning inside. She wanted to kick him out and get his keys back. No, she didn't. She wanted him to do what he did before. Apologize, beg, and she would take him back. Then she punched the windows of his car. The police came and she left. That night, she didn't sleep. The next day, she went back. Like a jealous, possessive, and obsessive person, she watched the front door. She saw David enter the house. She went home but returned. Finally, she saw David leaving with a young woman. She left for a while, then she returned. She then went home. On April 10th, 1955, the morning after what had happened, she thought David would have called, but he didn't. She became upset and came with the idea of killing David. She took a gun someone had given her 3 years before, but this was a lie. Ruth took a taxi to David's friend's house, but she saw David's car drive away. She walked to the nearest bar and saw David's car parked. David and Clive finally came out, and while David was searching for the keys of his car, Ruth took the gun from her handbag. She shot David the first time and missed, and he ran. Then Ruth went after him. She shot him the second time and he fell. She fired 3 shots while she stood over him. She tried to fire a 6th shot, but the bullet ricocheted and injured a bystander. She then asked Clive, David's friend, to call the police, and an off-duty police officer arrested. At the police station, Ruth made a detailed confession. They asked her why she did it, and she replied, "I do not really know." Quite seriously, "I was very upset." Ruth Ellis was charged with murder and she pleaded not guilty so she could tell her story in court. On June 20th, 1955, the trial began. During trial, the prosecution only asked one question to Ruth. When you fired the revolver at close range into the body of David Blakely, what did you intended to do? And her response was, "It's obvious when I shot him, I intended to kill him." The defense called a psychologist and he stated Ruth found herself in a situation which was intolerable for her. She feared David would return, he would continue to be unfaithful, she would keep taking him back, so she reached her breaking point. The defense team persuaded Ruth to plead not guilty because they intended to persuade the jury that the right verdict was guilty of manslaughter by reason of provocation. She was provoked. At the conclusion of the evidence, the judge discussed with the prosecution the law, but the jury wasn't present. The discussion was related to the issue of manslaughter by provocation and murder. The prosecutor stated she fired a gun with the intent to kill him, and it is murder, except if she was insane. But she was deemed sane after being evaluated by psychiatrists. He also stated that he was going to address the jury regarding provocation and asked the judge if there was any evidence of provocation, and the judge ruled there wasn't any. And according to the law, the judge had to direct the jury that the evidence didn't support a verdict of manslaughter, so it was off the table for the jury to bring in a guilty of manslaughter on the ground of provocation verdict. So the jury in just 20 minutes found Ruth Ellis guilty of murder, and she was sentenced to death by hanging. While awaiting for execution, Ruth told her mother she didn't want a petition to reprieve from the death sentence, but her relatives ignored her request. So we are going to take into account the defense's strategy. Ruth was provoked, and look at what happened right before she decided to kill David, and this is related to that man, Desmond Cussen. On the day before her execution, Ruth, who wanted to make her will, saw her lawyers. They asked her for the full story, and she asked them not to use it to secure reprieve. She then said that she was drinking with Desmond Cussen during the weekend. He gave her a gun and shooting practices, and Cussen was actually the one who drove her to the crime scene. But when everything went down, he left her there. So doesn't this look like she might have been provoked? They were drinking, she was furious at David, she's given a gun, and conversation goes on and on. So maybe Desmond made some comments and instigated the whole thing. He added fuel to her burning rage. What do you think? So on July 13th, 1955, Ruth Ellis was taken to an adjacent execution room and she was hanged. At the end, she believed it was fair. She deserved it. She would somehow be free too. She was only 28. Even though the execution was supported by the British public, it helped the support to abolish the death penalty. George Ellis, Ruth's husband, killed himself on August 2nd, 1958. In 1969, Ruth's mother was found unconscious in a gas-filled room. She never fully recovered. Ruth's son, Andy, took his own life in 1982 after he destroyed his mother's grave. The trial judge sent money every year for Andy's upkeep. The prosecution counsel paid for the boy's funeral. Georgina, Ruth's daughter, went to foster care when George took his own life, and she died of cancer when she was 50. So, this is the case of Ruth Ellis, a woman who embodies many women out there trapped in a roller coaster of violent relationships, moving from an abusive partner to another. She seemed like she reached a breaking point, all the anger, frustration building up, which led to that day. But I also have my suspicions Desmond Cussen took advantage of that, and his role is much bigger than we know. And this happened in the 50s, but abusive relationships live on, and this raises the questions of how poorly educated we are in the matters of love. Violence isn't love, possession isn't love, jealousy isn't love, devotion isn't love. Ruth had a distorted notion of love because David showed devotion, but most importantly, Ruth showed a genuine lack of self-love and respect. And to end this, don't forget to subscribe, click the notification bell button. Thank you for watching. See you the next time. Love yourself and stay safe.